Welcome back to Live Now from Fox, where another top story that we're following is this funding fight that threatens a partial government shutdown. Taking us out live to this image that we have of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Now, Democratic senators are vowing to oppose a funding bill for the Department of Homeland Security following the shooting death of a 37-year-old Minnesota man, a stand that increases the prospect of a partial government shutdown by the end of this week. Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer, in a social media post hours the Saturday shooting, said that what is happening in Minnesota is, quote, appalling, and that Democrats will not provide the votes to proceed to the appropriations bill if the DHS funding bill is included. And this also comes amid the fact that several lawmakers are also calling for the impeachment of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem over the operations happening in Minnesota. I want to get a full breakdown of all of this. So joining us next to discuss this more in depth is Jimena Bustillo. She is a reporter with NPR who covers immigration and DHS. Jimena, good to have you.
Good morning.
Good morning. So again, a breakdown of this. These shootings, the latest one happened last weekend. It's the second time a deadly shooting involved immigration officials in Minnesota. So that's having a large impact when we see how Congress is progressing going forward. But let's talk about specifically how Secretary Noem is handling this situation and how parties from both sides of the aisle, so Democrats and Republicans, are responding to this.
We did see an immediate response from Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem that was very quick to defend her agents and officers on the ground, saying that 37-year-old Alex Pretti had attacked the officers first before anything had happened, and that he had even gone as far as brandishing a weapon that they later found on him. Now, we saw last night in a Border Patrol early review that was sent to Congress that some of that timeline might not necessarily line up with the initial characteristics. In fact, there were only 5 seconds between when officers started engaging with Pretti and pushed him to the ground, and there was a struggle to arrest him before shots rang out by 2 different officers and agents. And so we are seeing the situation and information really evolve very quickly, but we have seen Republicans and Democrats both really criticize the administration for being so quick to characterize Pretti as the aggressor and even go as far as to label him a domestic terrorist.
I want to compare this specific situation that we're seeing here in Minnesota with perhaps past controversies involving DHS. So how does this really compare? Where are we at with that?
So the most recent past controversy with DHS is, of course, the killing of Nicole Macklin Good, also in Minneapolis. That is a little different in that it involved Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers, also known as ICE. And so, I always like to make the distinction between ICE and Border Patrol here. We have yet to learn a little bit more about Nicole Macklin Good's shooting. That is because ICE and DHS did not label her as a, quote, death in custody. And this might sound really technical, but by law, DHS has less days to report to Congress when it is a death in custody. And so that is why we do know more about Pretti's shooting and still have yet to learn about Good's shooting. However, these 2 shootings of U.S. citizens happened within weeks of each other. And as the Trump administration was really making a point to surge immigration enforcement within Minneapolis. And so, to say that they're not related or have a direct effect, at least in the public's eye, wouldn't necessarily be true. The public does see this as a sudden increase in violence on their streets and in their neighborhoods.
You made an important distinction there that I want to dig on a little bit further here, which is that shooting that involved Renee Good, who was killed in Minneapolis. Now, that happened with ICE agents, but this one with Pretti over this last weekend, it happened with CBP agents. So can you just talk to our viewers a little bit about what makes each of these agencies different and how they handle their operations respectively and what they're allowed to do?
So Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement are, publicly perceived to be pretty interchangeable, but their operations are seemingly pretty different. So Customs and Border Patrol and Protection often work within 100 miles of the border. They secure the borders, including marine borders. Of course, we see them at airports often, particularly international airports. But, their main their main role during this new Trump administration has been to go beyond that. And so we have seen, Border Patrol leadership really send their personnel into what is considered the interior of the country, so the inner non-border regions, to assist ICE. Now, ICE is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and their main role is to do that enforcement within the interior regions of the country. A lot of their operations are known as being maybe not as out there or as public facing as we may have seen over the past year. And so, they're very used to doing targeted arrests in certain areas. They have a few different divisions that even go beyond immigration and focus more on fraud, crime, and money laundering that may or may not have to do with immigration. And so, they're a little bit more of a diverse agency in terms of their investigative components as well.
Taking a look more closely in Minneapolis. So just yesterday, we brought the news that Border Czar Tom Homan was going to go down to the city. He spoke with Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, also spoke with Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. What do we know about perhaps any changes in the operations happening down there in the city of Minneapolis, and also Secretary Noem's role within this large-scale operation now that Tom Homan is there in the city?
Mm-hmm. Homan's coming in right as we heard from Governor Walz that Border Patrol Commander Greg Bovino was coming out. And Bovino had been really nationally recognized as one of the leaders on the ground of the rank and file as DHS was taking immigration officials from city to city. So he was in Chicago, he was in North Carolina, he was in Louisiana, and then he was back up in Minneapolis, really doing the rounds. And now he seems to have been removed from that kind of really public facing, on the ground commanding position. Tom Homan is seen as coming in to sort of stabilize the situation a little bit. This has been labeled as, a bit of a PR difficulty for the Trump administration, who was really quick to defend its officers and agents before there was information that came out and before any sort of investigation, external or internal, had been conducted. And so this kind of reshuffle does kind of reset a little bit of what their tactics are going to be.
I want to talk a little bit about this partial government shutdown that's being threatened over the funding for DHS. Obviously, Democrats are saying they're not going to move through with this based off of all of these operations. Jimena, but how likely are these Democratic proposals going to be to restrict this funding? And how likely is that going to have an effect on the operations?
It kind of still remains to be seen. It does look like Democrats are digging their heels even harder than before on, finding a way to strip out the DHS funding bill out of the entire rest of the package, or, really putting a stop to the entire package altogether, which would risk an entire government shutdown and the funding of several other federal agencies, not just DHS and not just ICE. Democrats are looking for very specific potential proposals. Keyword is still potential here. There hasn't been a deal or, any sort of set like vehicle bill to kind of really couch and ask under. But they are looking at things like mandating that federal officers not be masked, mandating body cameras, additional training on crowd control and de-escalation tactics. And then, we're seeing like additional requests to not conduct enforcement at churches, hospitals, and schools. There's a lot of back and forth about this. I think Republicans know that they have the majority in the House, and so ultimately legal changes are up to them. They also have the presidency, of course, and so there's talk about potential executive action that could come. But ultimately, Democrats might not want that. Executive actions are really easy to change and overturn, go back on, and so we'll have to see if anything comes down to the legal negotiating table in Congress.
And I feel like we've been focusing a lot about Democrats because they have been very outspoken against a lot of what's going on in a lot of major cities across the country when it comes to immigration enforcement. But really, what are we hearing from Republicans on this issue?
In the last few days, we have seen Republicans come out in mass, really criticizing the Trump administration's latest tactics in Minneapolis, but particularly that very quick judgment and characteristics of the shooting of Alex Pretti. So much so that in about 2 weeks, the leadership of ICE and of Border Patrol and of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which handles legal immigration, are going to be brought in to testify before not one but two separate committees. So House Homeland and Senate Homeland. And those kind of pressures and drives are, of course, driven by Republican members of these committees. They are often the ones that put out the asks for administration members to come in and talk, and are listened to when these asks come in, since they are the leadership of that committee. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem will be appearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee, in about 5 weeks as well, and that was announced this week. And so it's definitely, I think, not lost on the entire Republican Party that there needs to be some sort of broader conversation, an opportunity to, on the record, ask questions on both sides. And we are seeing Republicans, take immediate steps to do that, even if it's just by hosting these hearings.
Jimena, as I mentioned before, your reporting really focuses on DHS and immigration. Is there any storyline that you are specifically focused on that maybe you think hasn't gotten enough attention or you find particularly unique?
Many. I think I have many stories like that. I think what we are really seeing right now is the Trump administration really expand the breadth of what it can do with its own executive power of immigration. And to start the year, we have seen this with the re-review of several refugee cases, also particularly in Minneapolis. Many families who thought that they had gone through this the right way, or quote unquote the right way, are now potentially facing deportation. We are seeing the closure of immigration courts across the country, namely in San Francisco, which can potentially create additional backlogs in the system. And so really kind of seeing how the administration is going to handle its own pressures by bringing in new people that could be potentially down the deportation pipeline, as well as closing other avenues and limiting other forms of seeking legal permission to be in the United States. It's going to be, that's what I'm going to be watching this year in terms of their strategies.
All right, it sounds like we're going to have you on for another segment to really do a deep dive on all of these angles when it comes to immigration. Jimena Bustillo with NPR. We appreciate your time here at Live Now from Fox. We'll be in touch. We do want to step away for a quick commercial break. At the tail end of that interview, I did bring up this. It's a live image that we're getting just outside of Minneapolis in Minnesota. This is the memorial that continues to grow for Alex Pretti. He was a 37-year-old ICU nurse who was shot and killed over the weekend, just last Saturday, by a Border Patrol agent there in Minneapolis, and now has become the focus, this one, but also the other deadly shooting involving an ICE agent, that one of Renee Good, also in Minneapolis. A lot of this has been the focus when it comes to a criticism over ICE and CBP operations across the country. And as I mentioned just yesterday, Border Czar Tom Homan met with Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz to discuss the situation. We'll be right back.